Right, so I'm here with Alan Sabrosky, formerly of the U.S. Army War College and dissident writer and influencer, let's say. And yeah, we're just going to talk about what's going on currently with this country and where things are headed, where he came from, what his outlook is on the way things are going today, and what we can possibly do about the parasitic influences currently draining our society of its lifeblood and will to live. So, is there anything you want to start out with, or
Um,
I was
Probably just a prefatory note. For the better part of a year, I've been going blind, and I haven't written anything since I guess February, February of this year rather. And I got a complication of skin cancer a few weeks ago. So it's going to be a little bit difficult for me sometimes to speak because it's having some effect on my speaking ability. And I apologize to anyone who's watching this and listening to this who has some difficulty. I will try and do my best. Uh,
I think
and
people
my
people will
friend
be able
Helen
to
will
get
do
the
that.
message. People will be able to get the message through. So most people know you, at least people in the 9/11 truth community or whatever, for you being one of the early people to speak out about the Israeli role in that particular incident. Now I know you've gone over this in other interviews and stuff, and I don't want to repeat old things too much, but what was like the dead giveaway for you when that made you decide beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was Israel that had done 9/11?
I was looking at the situation and thinking of the number of the thing requirements that the people who pulled this off would have to have. And there was no other country that had that combination of motive, expertise, and ability to escape afterwards. The Israeli hand was very prominent. Dual U.S. Israeli citizens were all over the place. Uh, and it was very quickly after the first day, when I look back on this, when I look back on 9/11, after the first day, suddenly videos that contradicted the official line, including a CNN video with a Pentagon correspondent looking at the building and saying that nothing there that I can't pick up with one hand. And your planes do not disappear that way when they crash. And it just sort of struck me at that point that no other combination of things could be used or possessed by any other country that might want to hurt us. And there is a large number of them because we have done hurtful things to many countries. And not surprisingly, they want to take us down. And that part of it, by that time, I've become fully aware of the extent of Israeli influence uh, through dual U.S. Israeli citizens running throughout both houses of Congress, through the White House, and through many of the executive agencies. And it was almost a process of deduction. Little pieces just came together. And I've started looking at them again and wondering just exactly who else might have done it. And there was no one else. There simply was no one else. It was almost like it had been scripted, which of course it had been scripted, that the incident itself was scripted. And there were anomalies right from the beginning that made absolutely no sense. I actually did a short paper, about 6 printed pages, uh, 2 or 3 weeks after the 9/11, at the request of a local journalist down in Mississippi. I don't know how she got my name, but she got, what would you think? Do you have any questions about 9/11? That's how she phrased it. And so I sat back and I thought about it and said, yeah, I have a number of questions on this. Uh, One of the things that was most striking, and we talked about this last night, Helen, was that there there is now no celebration for the people who died, who would have been martyrs, quote unquote, to the other cause. And those sort of celebrations are usually used to commemorate their actions, uh, nice funerals, and also as a recruiting action to try and get more people to want to do the same thing and be honored in the same way. There was nothing of that. That the people who were on those planes, if they were what the official story said, uh, basically died unremarked by the people for whom they were supposedly doing this. And those things made it very clear to me that I didn't have to go any further, but to look deeply into the Mossad line. And when I said Mossad, there's the Israelis have several intelligence agencies. I'm using that just as a catch-all for all of them together on it. And that's what brought me to it. But it was the disappearance. It was the disappearance of so many of the films that were seen on the first day and some on the second day, completely disappearing from the
And the
media.
security footage from the Pentagon too.
Yeah, and the security footage from the Pentagon. And looking at that, um, I think I'm not sure if it was a tactical error or a strategic error. Um, I decided to focus on the World Trade Center. Partly because they were the most visible. There was a WTC-7. I said that's a smoking artillery brigade. It's not a smoking gun going down into its own footprint in 7 seconds. And a very informative short video, which is part of a longer one by Danny Jowenko, who was a demolitions expert. And he said very clearly that this was a professional job done by a team of experts. Now, I have no doubt that there are many people in Al Qaeda and elsewhere who don't like us. If I were them, I wouldn't like us either, really. But they don't have that combination of expertise and the ability to get out alive afterwards. And someone had to do that. And the plane stories made no sense, simply made no sense. And so that was it. And it really, actually, that's not quite it. Um, I had run into the work of Richard Gage and others on that, but it was Danny Jowenko's video more than anything else that pointed to the Israelis. That was the hand that was in the sun. I mean, other people might have been part of it in it, but that was ours. They had to have considerable assistance in the area where these planes supposedly struck and in the United States in order to allow them to get out afterwards if they did pull us. And the Saudis don't have that. The Saudis don't have that. They don't have any dual citizens littering the American government with more power over the government in the name of a foreign country than they do for the United States. Uh, they might want to, but they don't. And I think there was a combination. Let me try and remember. It's been 14 years since I really thought about it that much. Uh, the Pentagon correspondence talking to his anchor in Atlanta. He had just gotten back. The building was smoking in the background. He had just gotten back from going into the building, into the Pentagon, with some of the other first responders, and no debris. There's just simply no debris there. And then there was a Virginia County, I'm sorry, Arlington County police lieutenant who was literally a first responder, and he had been talking to some USA Today security people about security for the building. And that was the CNN building, not the Pentagon. And then he was a news presence. There was about 4 or 5 people talking to the assembled networks. And he said, I don't understand what's happening. They told me that a plane had hit the Pentagon, and I don't see any airplane parts anywhere. He has since backtracked on that.
Oh, he found airplane parts in his memory looking backwards.
I think there was probably some in
A few Easter eggs.
one of the
Yeah.
laboratories was something like that. But those two, and then the 5 dancing Israelis
Yeah.
who had set up
Giveaway.
who were set up their cameras in the Bergen, New Jersey area before the first plane hit, and they were high-fiving and flashing Zippo lighters, and people in the area called the police who came out and got them. And they were Israelis, which is a little, of course, they later appeared on
Israeli
Israeli
television.
television,
Yeah.
yep, and made that very clear. And then one by Dan Rather from CBS, and he was describing a van packed with explosives in New York City that was stopped by the police, and there were 2 people in it. He never said Israelis, but that was, and so why did this disappear? I mean, if the police did a really good job and intercepted this truckload of explosives, same sort of a thing that earlier had taken out the Marine barracks in Beirut. It's that one of those things. And why didn't they keep talking about it? Why didn't they mention it? I mean, I would have think that would have been, a pat on the back for the
Very
police.
important. Yeah.
You really did a good thing, and you saved easily far more casualties than there would have been in the World Trade Centers. And when I put these together and saw the story of the dancing Israelis was sort of buried in the inner columns in the back pages, at that point I knew, I'd had over 40 years of dealing with military affairs, strategy, and you develop an instinct for these things. And so I followed it up, and that's where they went.
You were already aware of the USS Liberty incident at this point, yes?
I was, yes. And in fact, I have found in the past when trying to explain why the Israelis did this and or how they could have done it, because these are our friends, our buddies, not really, not really. And I begin by talking about the USS Liberty, that after 5 hours of surveillance it, by Israeli aircraft, it was attacked by some fighter bombers, and then a mortar torpedo boat put a torpedo into it, killed and wounded over 200 American sailors and Marines. All the relief forces were withdrawn and called back by first Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, and then Lyndon Baines Johnson, the President of the United States. And even today, there are many Navy officers who've never heard of the USS Liberty, but they have heard of the USS Pueblo, which was taken by North Korea. No one was killed. Nothing was taken off the ship. Well, they obviously looked the ship over very good for them, but they didn't do any damage to the ship. We got the ship back. They know that, but they don't know the USS Liberty.
Is it a lack of intellectual curiosity on their part, or is it just they only know what they're taught in school?
Uh, Probably a bit of both. The only people in the military who really hone the notion of curiosity are the people in intelligence.
Mm.
And I worked in intelligence for several years and in and out of the service, and was very familiar with the process of that. And so I am curious about a lot of things in addition to liking to read and look up things. But that was very clear. And when I first put the two pieces together in a public presentation, it was at an Assemblies of God congregation at the invitation of their pastor in State College, Pennsylvania, and just put up on the screen what the USS Liberty looked like and what the ship they thought the Israelis said they had attacked, which was on horse transport. Clearly, it's not that. Clearly, it isn't that at all. And I then, a few years later, ran across an article which included an NSA intercept of a communications between the lead Israeli pilot and his base at Ashdod. And he got the orders to attack and said on intercept, "But sir, it's an American ship." And says the controller in Ashdod, "Never mind, hit it anyway." And it was not only an NSA intercept in an article, it was also in 2018, February of 2018, in Haaretz.
It is interesting how the Israeli media tends to be more willing to expose the misdeeds of the Israeli government than any US media outlets.
It is that. And what was unfortunately the explanation for that is that they are so certain, they being the Israelis, are so certain that thanks to the Zionist or Jewish community in the United States, that they have such control over American policy, such control over American media, that these things can be discussed in their side, part of an internal political war with Haaretz sitting a little bit on the left of it, and some of the other media more right wing, although they're variations of right. I don't think there's a center.
Yeah, there's no
really
thing in
center.
Israel.
I don't think there's a center or left really out there on it. But they're so confident that they can suppress any information and do so with impunity that they don't longer care. And I think that's one of the things that's become really clear in the last few years with the redefinition of anti-Semitism signed into an executive order by Donald Trump in December of 2019, and it had no media play at all. He just accepting the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which basically says that any criticism of Israel, its actions, its government, its military, or its supporters is anti-Semitism. I guess you can pick up a bottle of Mogan David wine and say, this is probably the foulest tasting wine I've ever had, which I did, by the way, and it
Oh
is the
no.
foulest taste. Oh, yeah. I was a 17-year-old boy, and that was the only wine they
Like
had.
Manischewitz or something like that?
Oh, even worse.
Oh no.
It's really even worse.
It's bad.
Um, but I, there was legislation that was introduced in the Congress in 2023, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which proposed to have that be the legal definition of anti-Semitism and therefore something punishable by law. Uh, but I didn't know that he being Trump, had signed that executive order in 2019 doing just that. And this was to an attempt to put it in statutory line. But he also signed that in 2025 after he came back in, for second term,
Just to make sure.
expanding
Oh
expanding
my
the
God.
scope of that into the universities. So it becomes, I would say, from the two executive orders, and someone has read the text to me, so I wasn't able to see it myself, but read the text to me. From those two executive orders and the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which has been reintroduced in this Congress, it it didn't get passed the first time. They're going for a second time on it. Um, it makes it virtually impossible to do anything about Israeli crimes or about the actions of Israel in the United States and elsewhere, no matter how brutal they are. You can't criticize it. I expect that because the legislation has not yet been passed, I expect that if the government tries to apply that with the executive orders, with the two executive orders, um, that there would be a challenge in the courts.
You would hope.
I would hope, but even so, that would be very hard to beat.
Now, you've said before that if it got out what Israel's role in 9/11 was, what they had done in general, what they had done, I guess what they had done on Liberty as well, that they would be wiped off the face of the earth. Do you still believe that? Or do you think Americans are too cucked?
Excuse me. No, I no longer believe that. I think that ended that ended with the first Trump administration, and the second is just continuing it. His role, as we talked about before, Helen, his role was basically three things. One is to do things that Israel wanted, like moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. A second is to facilitate Israeli actions elsewhere, and he's done that. He recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, for example. Uh, they're talking about it now for the West Bank and
Yeah,
Gaza, of
that's what
course.
Miriam Adelson demanded as
Yeah,
a conjunction of her
yeah,
donation.
that's what you did. It's $100 million. That's fine. Let's do it. And the third was to attack Iran, and we've done that. And it's like anything else in it. The first action may not be everything that the Israelis wanted, but that first step has been taken. That was standard crossing the Rubicon. That's exactly what it was. And whether it set back the Iranian nuclear program by a few months or obliterated it makes absolutely no difference. We're in the war with Iran. That was it. And nothing else really matters. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm forgetting things. There was a fourth thing, and that is to pacify his base.
Yes.
Because the most important, this is something that a lot of people, even good friends of mine in Europe and Asia, just don't really understand that the American electorate, the Trump base, as conservatives, what Republicans, whatever you want to call them, the labels don't really mean that much anymore. And certainly they don't mean what they did 20 years ago. but his base is the wild card. It's got about 18 million veterans, most of them conservatives, not all of them, but most of them conservatives, and part of his base. There's something between 80 and 100 million legal gun owners, including a lot of these 18 million veterans who were in the United States. And they're very heavily armed, the most heavily armed civilian population in history. Uh, that's a wild card. If something happened to enrage that base, uh, it could be very unpredictable. But it would have to be something that directly affected them and not something that happened 20 or 30 years ago. And that's the wild card. And he's there, and he does it. I When I was talking to Paul Adams a couple of days ago, I remarked that he that Trump is sort of like the Pied Piper of Mar-a-Lago. That's what I said.
Yes.
And his base is tootling right along after him. That's why that fake assassination attempt in Butler was used. Uh, the Democrats would never have tried that, never have tried that, uh, because they understand, the leadership of that party understands, even if their base does not, just what the veterans and the armed people, armed citizenry in the United States could do. It might be chaotic and disorganized and undisciplined, uh, but a lot of that is very, very real. I mean, they're very strong and some good people in that. And they tried very, very hard to keep that out of the public eye. And so they would never have done that, but then they weren't supposed to. And that was so blatantly fake. I feel sorry for the other people who were killed and wounded in that whole episode. Uh, but they had their patsy, they got the point, and that was the same thing as happened in Dallas to JFK.
Yep. Yep. And it had the same effect of galvanizing a nation in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and the Jewish hand rests pretty hard in all of these instances, in every one of these instances. Uh, and even in the 1960s and 70s, when the media was relatively good in a lot of ways, did have some decent people like Brinkley and Huntley and Brinkley, Eric Sevareid, others who would present the news, and then they would have a personal view, and they'd either call, one word or one quote or opinion would be on the screen, right on the screen. And you knew then that this was an opinion piece. Now, it wasn't quite that clear cut because clearly any one of the producers or the score correspondents could slant the information that was presented as news and what
Or just choose what to cover and what not to
or
cover.
what
That's often how it's done.
that's it, Helen. Yeah. Choose what to cover and what's not. And if it's not covered, it didn't happen.
Right.
And that was when the people really hadn't had this browbeaten into them like they have over the last 60 years. I look back, uh, at my youth. I was born in 1941, so things like the World War II, I didn't understand it. I'd heard about it. I was World War II. Who knows about it? You're 5 years old. You don't pay attention to that. But there were a lot of veterans coming back, and then the next war in Korea, and veterans coming back from that. And in my teenage years, in my 20s, when I went in the Marines, uh, we knew quite a bit about the world. Actually, going out there, we learned a lot about the wrong things. We didn't know and were not taught about the atrocities that American troops committed in Germany to the Germans after World War II and what they did during the war, burning cities to the ground, literally.
Mhm.
Uh, but there wasn't this constant refrain of Israel, 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 anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism. There was none of that through the 60s. And I would say until the 70s. Then it started. Um, and that made a great deal of difference. And I can't believe how people today are absorbing propaganda that is presented as lies as truth when it is just propaganda.
Yeah, we talked a little bit last night about like the ritual humiliation of the US military and the population at large. Obviously nobody who saw that, who sat there for that Pete Hegseth speech where he's kept calling everybody fat and bearded and out of shape and completely blaming them for losing wars, even though it's
Yeah,
obviously not about personal grooming, it's about fighting the wrong wars.
yeah.
How far back do you think that degradation began? Because obviously you don't just plop a self-respecting man into an audience like that and he sits there and takes being lectured and bird-handed at by
Yeah,
this like crotch skateboard hitting
yeah.
pipsqueak. Like how far back do you think that the decay began?
Uh, let me take one different tack on it just for a second on
Sure.
this. Oh, well, not a second. Uh, I talked about that presentation uh, that Hegseth and Trump did to the assembled 800 odd generals and admirals. Uh, and I said, and was mistaken, I said that it was a good thing to have done, but that sort of thing of a wake-up call needed to have been done in February, you right when the administration was starting. I had not seen or heard a video of that. I had heard summaries of it from news programs, different ones talking about what was said and very, very carefully edited what was said.
Hmm.
And none of the presentation with that sort of like ritual humiliation.
Yeah.
I would think it's sort of like a ritual humiliation. Um, what astonished me in it, uh, and then I'll get to your question, Helen. Well, what really surprised me in it and was a signal of just how deep the rot has gone is that there are a lot of Marine generals, a lot of airborne generals and people who've been in some pretty tough things, and not one stood up and walked out. Not one stood up and walked out. I mean, you can't do much to a four-star general or admiral. You really can't. Uh, but none of them walked out, and just like that. How far back does it go? Part of it, not the ritual humiliation, but part of it started in the aftermath of Vietnam. Um, there was there was some internal soul searching within the armed services at that point in time. Like, we lost. How did we do that? But it didn't go very far. In the 80s and early 90s, the a few senior officers I knew, a Navy admiral, four-star admiral, and a three-star Marine general, um, were really good people, and they'd risen up to the lines, and they didn't indicate that their immediate successors were engaged in or were being subjected to this kind of ritual humiliation. Uh, Probably in Clinton and Bush too, somewhere in that point, when the military could look at 9/11 and get a position paper from the Secretary of Defense, uh, saying that we'll take out 7 countries in 5 years, none of whom were involved in 9/11. But uh, that was a project for a new American century, which is laughable. Uh, that a bunch of Jewish guys who happened to be Zionist, why am I not surprised, had put on the hit list, for the United States. And no one in the military even blinked on it. You know, they were surprised at it, but they never thought about questioning it. Or if they did so very quietly, and there was none of the ritual humiliation that occurred uh, in this case. The the only reason we did not complete that and take out Syria and Egypt and Iran in Bush's 2 terms was because the Iraqi resistance was so strong and inflicted some casualties that we did not really expect and basically slowed down the timetable. But as it is right now, the only one of those countries which hasn't really been taken down is Egypt, of course, which gets a good amount of money from us as well, and Iran, which has been attacked. But we now have American boots on the ground in Gaza, or right now I think it's in the northern part of Gaza, and it's sort of to monitor the ceasefire. And if anyone who thinks that that's going to be done in an even-handed way, it better go back to looking for the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus, because they probably have more realism to it than the idea that the United States is an honest broker, which it is not.
Yeah, and the degree to which the United States has squandered the amount of international goodwill that it had amassed rather in the last
Mhm.
century, do you think that that contributes to this sort of the ritual humiliation or the lowering of the collective vibration of the armed forces, or
I think so. I think it clearly does on it.
is now when Americans show up on your shores, it's not like culturally interesting or look, we
Yeah,
like these guys because we've seen them on TV. It's oh crap, here come the terrorists.
yeah, something like that. That's very close to it. That's pretty much what it is. There was a film and a book called The Ugly American, you know, 60 odd years ago. Uh, but America was generally respected, not always liked, but generally respected, uh, except if you were in the Caribbean and you have to realize that manifest destiny meant
Hmm,
you. Uh, but America is not respected anymore. There is, it's feared, sort of like having an idiot child with a machine gun walking around the room. Our home, America today, if I were to describe it uh, with a single sentence, it would be America has become Israel's homicidal bully in the global sandbox,
that sounds
and
very
that's
accurate.
it.
Okay, so the Jewish war on our way of life has now seeped out of the institutions where it's been very successfully waged for the last several decades into the very fabric which holds body and soul together. You see all these stories about poisoning scandals where it turns out that like baby food or organic fruit or bottled water have been mysteriously contaminated with arsenic and cadmium and lead and mercury. And is there sorry, and our groundwater is being polluted with dioxins of the sort previously used as chemical defoliants during the Vietnam War, and not too far from here, the East Palestine train disaster. What are our options for fighting an enemy that so desperately wants to not only kill and conquer, but also immiserate and sicken us? Can the usual rules of engagement apply to an enemy like this?
No, they can't. They cannot. Um, in this concept of projection, which you project onto your enemy some of the values and the habits that you have. And the Israelis, the Jews, have basically projected their worst side, and which is, if you want to see what their worst side is, read the Talmud, but be very close to the toilet because you'll throw up after a little while on it, and what they think is good, and that they projected all some of the worst things of that onto their enemies. And they're not, when they describe everyone who doesn't like them as a Nazi, well, not really. I mean, everyone who doesn't like them has good reason not to like them for what they have done over the centuries and what they have done to us. Uh, it's it's something that I find very, very odd. I have one Jewish grandparent, which I didn't know about until I was in my 40s, and when my father happened to tell me, and he we both gave it about the same amount of attention that it deserved, which was about 10 seconds or something like that. It just didn't matter to either one of us. Um, but I think that to to be able to expose what the Israelis have done and why they are so powerful and why they are present in so many of the nastier movements like the transgender craze, like any of that, and they're so prominent in them. But they no longer hide. They no longer hide at all. And that's why I mentioned earlier that they're absolutely convinced that they have won and that we can hurt them. Some of us can hurt them. Some of us can embarrass them. Uh, Danny Jowenko, that Dutch demolitions expert that I mentioned, who had a good assessment on the 9/11 uh, actions in New York City, and he literally said it's a professional job by a team of experts. And I mentioned two or three times in that interview I did with Susan Madaris, uh, and 2 days later he's dead.
I read about
I,
that.
uh, Literally, and I had a very odd feeling. I said, I hope I didn't do anything like that, you know. I'm serious.
Yeah,
You know, because I
these
mentioned how
people don't.
important he was to because this was hard, incontrovertible evidence from an expert, an acknowledged international expert on building demolition. And if he said it was a controlled demolition, he knows he was a good source for that. And I've felt ever since, you know, that it may not have been anything that I said, it may not have been anything other people said, but I had that little queasy feeling that it might have been just one more thing and say, oh, we'll just get rid of it. You know, he had a car accident in the Netherlands in the morning, about 7 or 7:30, I think, something like that. Uh, he was strapped in. He died. His German Shepherd was in the car with him. That's a four-legged shepherd, not a two-legged shepherd. His German Shepherd was in the car with him, wasn't strapped in, and the dog lived. Uh, I guess the dog wasn't considered a Zionist or something like that. I don't
Well, the
know.
dog was considered a
Oh, it
Zionist.
was
Maybe the
considered.
dog did it.
You're
You never
right.
know.
You're right. That was one of
German
the.
Shepherds can be tricky.
Yeah, that really, but they're a little bit tough on getting hands on things. But I think, you know, what I really think now, unfortunately, is is that they're correct.
That they've won.
Yeah, they won the battle. They won the battle for Western civilization. You know, Hegseth uh, gave a talk to a Jewish organization. I do not know which one it was. I could only see the white and blue flag behind him, and he was standing up.
Yeah.
And this was before he was nominated to be Secretary of Defense. And but he was saying to them that I may have this out of sequence that Americanism and Zionism, or Zionism and Americanism, whichever you wish, are the two pillars of Western
Oh
civilization,
my God.
which is nonsense. Uh, that Western Americanism is certainly that, uh, and much of what Europe has done and built in the world is pretty much a pillar of the Western civilization. But Zionism is its nemesis, completely its nemesis. It's not. It has not a good scrap out there for anyone to find. One of the things that I wondered when I started looking at this in 1947 or 48, I think, after the founding of Israel, uh, Menachem Begin, who was a terrorist, but he was a terrorist for the Israelis.
He was there, terrorist.
He was their terrorist. You know. He was either invited to the United States or was just coming to the United States without invitation. I never found a good answer to that, which probably means he wasn't invited. But there were 26 prominent Jewish intellectuals, uh, people like Hannah Arendt, uh, Albert Einstein, you know, at that level, who signed a open letter in the New York Times urging the U.S. government not to receive Begin, not to have anything to do with him, that he was a foul person.
Hmm.
And they said it much more eloquently than I did, but of course they had time to do that. The thing is that you can get 26 Jewish intellectuals of that prominence to sign such a letter today, and if you did, it would never be published in the New York Times.
Yeah, they would be terrified.
Of course, they were terrified on it, but in the 40s it was still possible, and none of this nonsense about a Holocaust had been contrived yet. You know, I think I read once that the 6 million figure in the more recent times was mentioned in the 1950s, early 50s on it. But it has been mentioned many, many, many times on it. I saw the collage of things
Yeah.
from various New York Times papers, 6 million, this 6 million. I don't know, is 6 million some sort of a, well, and what's one of the things that happened, the sheer ridiculousness of the Holocaust argument seeped through that in a number of ways so that each of the death camps had their death toll dialed back. Uh,
I
uh,
remember
uh,
that. Yeah.
okay, like Auschwitz, but finally, I'm sorry, Dachau was supposed to be something like 240, 250,000. They dialed it back to 20,400 or something like that, which is probably still an exaggeration. But nonetheless, even these reduced numbers still add up to 6 million. You can't
That's
question the 6
it's a
million. In
very
fact,
special kind of math.
it is
You
well,
can't.
it's the new math. What can you do on
That's
it?
true. Math is
But that's
racist.
really true. You say, well, but if you've taken 4.5 million out of this, that means there's only 1.5 million. No, it's 6 million. Adding it up, adding it up.
You think that's the reason why they're trying to get math out of public schools so people can't question that
I think,
narrative?
well, actually, that's a different thing. The two teachers unions, NEA and uh, AFT, have just over 17,000 school districts organized, and plus some private schools, plus a lot of private schools out there. And they're still continuing to push DEI down everyone's throat. And the kids are coming up with it. They're still getting that. Uh, but one of the things they're also doing because of that is that they are making a full court press to legalize and normalize any type of perversion that's out there. And there are very few that don't have Jews in the leadership of them.
It's very much a lightning rod issue when you talk about sexualizing children, and it attracts a lot of attention, and it also allows them, it serves as a distraction, I think, a lot
Yep,
of times to do things behind the scenes that,
it
um,
it it, it does that very much on it, and it's uh, it's not a surprise. You know, this is one of those cases of give the devil their due. And they think in long terms. They think in a
yes.
long term plan. It's not the sort of thing that you've got to keep going all the time or you're failing. No, that's not true. Good revolutionary doctrine is that you make a leap forward when you can and then shuffle back a little bit back, and but always going forward. And you don't they don't see any kind of a temporary setback as something that's unrecoverable. Nothing is unrecoverable as long as you've got the votes and the power. As you said, it's not who
Yeah,
votes it, who counts the
who counts
votes.
the votes
Yeah,
exactly.
but that doesn't. But yeah, that's it.
So since all of our property taxes are going to fund these schools and this revolutionary, counter-revolutionary impulse, is there any possibility for people to drop out of the system and sort of form their own communities, or is it just the legal structure is too prohibitive of that and the financial extrication mechanism is too far gone?
Well, I would think that it is possible to do some of that in a minor way. Uh, Homeschooling is something that I would
Yes.
push really hard. Uh, 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, in April of 2023, I was invited back to Lansing, Michigan, to give a talk to a forum there, uh, and most of the people there were homeschooling their kids,
Wow.
and and in fact, they were just getting ready with preparation for the first time. They were going to give the kids something that I shouldn't say kids, they're young people, whatever you wish on it. Uh, give them something that they hadn't had before, a senior prom. And because that's socializing in itself. But they had 400 couples there.
Wow.
I'm not sure if it's 400 couples or 400
People.
individual
Yeah.
children, but that was it. Get out of the education system. The system itself is broken so badly, and the teachers' unions are so foul that you have to say, "Stop the train! I want to get off." And that the homeschooling thing is possible to help. Forming communities concedes the battleground to your enemy.
How so?
Withdrawing,
Mm.
withdrawing. And it can be done in a selected way if it were if there were any possibility of seeing or creating a network of these communities, a physical network of these communities, then I wouldn't say that. But right now, every conservative state, like Mississippi, where I'm living now, uh, every conservative state has large and small urban power centers of the Democrats. Mostly are black majorities, some are black and brown, but they're clearly on the left, and the FT has got that. Uh, the equivalent of that in blue states is that there's a lot of small towns and rural areas that are relatively conservative. But if you look at a map and look at where these things are, all of the critical nodes of transportation, communication, and finance are in the blue controlled cities.
That's a good point.
And they're in, and you cannot do anything anywhere, anytime in history without money. You got to have that. And whoever controls the methods of communication and transportation and finance, they control you. Uh, the Civil War was very straightforward. You had contiguity there among a number of the states that so they could actually secede and think that they could make a nation and could have made a nation, except for our invasion, which is what they think of it down there. So one person said that just the war of damn Yankee aggression. She said it was how her grandmother described it, and that was probably about the way that a lot of others feel down there. But you don't have that contiguity now. You just don't have that. It's like you can take a bunch of blue marbles and throw it at a map of the United States, and you'll see that there is none. That just don't have that survivability that was possible in the Civil War.
Is that partially because of the alienation that's created by modern society, or is it just because people don't know their neighbors anymore? They've been so divorced from like where they come from and everything. I mean, I know I grew up in a very alienating suburban community where we didn't know any of our neighbors or anything like that. So there was no sense of community. And I think that a lot of people in my generation and younger are dealing with that. But
That's interesting because I, when I was growing up, we didn't know our neighbors.
yeah.
Uh,
No, you mentioned you didn't lock your door.
no, no. Lansing, Michigan was the state capital, is the state capital. Sorry, I made a slight slip there. Uh, and it's very different now. Not completely gone like some cities, but it's very different. Uh, but yeah, it was just I can't remember ever in the three houses I lived in growing up that I would lock the doors or see my mother not lock the door uh, or anyone else. And it was very common for just people to knock on the door and you'll hear from inside, come on in. You didn't have to worry what was going on. Now, other cities like Detroit weren't quite that good, but there was a lot of that openness in it. And if you don't know who your neighbors are, not just one neighbor, know your neighbors, there's no concept of trust and community.
Yeah, no, I'm just interested in getting to the bottom of how that happened. Like just because people were moved around because of their work or something, or was it just that people were conditioned from watching television to behave in certain ways or expect their neighbors to behave in certain ways? I know we talked a little bit last night about
Mhm.
people being raised on TV shows and how it instills sociopathic behavior and things like Seinfeld and everything with a laugh
Mhm.
track where people just learn to be complete scumbags. But I don't know how to what degree that has destroyed trust in communities.
That's probably part of it. If if I could wave a wand and something would happen, I would take every book, pamphlet, video, movie, paper of Benjamin Spock and company and burn it. That nothing has done more harm, I think, to the concept of child raising than him and his work.
Hmm. What makes you say that?
Um, Basically, it does not allow for discipline, and people are supposed to be self-actualized and do your own thing on that side of it. Uh, Not helpful to us.
Yeah,
Not,
good luck self-actualizing in a society that teaches you not to have a self.
yeah.
It's not gonna work.
Exactly, exactly.
You've been extensively and publicly terrorized by the Zionist entity and its agents over the years. To what degree do you think that that's just a retaliation against you, or to what degree do you think it's meant to silence others who might think of coming forward? Because I'm sure you've had talks with people behind the scenes where they thank you for speaking out about this stuff, but
Hmm.
say that they can't publicly talk about it
Yeah,
because of this and that.
I would think the second.
They made an example of you.
I think the second, yeah. Well, they made a an example of Danny Joenko.
Yeah, that for
Uh,
sure.
that was one. Second thing that they can do is to ruin you. And the more power they have, the more wealth they have, the more they can ruin you. Um, I was I had a veto on me from APAC in the late 70s after I wrote a couple of articles on the USS Liberty incident and gave a couple of talks on that in Washington, D.C. And I was told, since I wasn't in the White House, I couldn't say that for certain, but I was told by a couple of people I knew who was on the White House Personnel Office that my name had been penciled in for a couple of assistant secretaryships uh, and one on the NSC, and all were vetoed. And it is not genuinely understood in this country that it isn't only senior officers or politicians that are examined and vetted by Jewish organizations. It's anyone who is being nominated for almost any position in the government right now. We'll have several Jewish organizations follow them around, look at what they're doing, see if they can find anything that they can use to control that person. Not necessarily to remove him from a list for an office, but to control it if the person is in an office. And it is discussed openly uh, in Israeli media. I found it really intriguing back when I could read, uh, to look at the comment section on some Israeli press, Haaretz, Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, a couple of others like that. And the exchanges, it wasn't only that the articles were, in some cases, pretty gruesome, it was the discussion of those articles on the letters to the editor, for example, comments on the actual article itself that would never be shown in the United States. And if that's the English language versions, I'm not sure if the Hebrew one is exactly the same. It probably is. Uh, but they don't even hide it. And that is probably because they literally own all the networks. They own all of the major entertainment venues. They own 95% of the advertising conglomerates in the Western world. There are three of them in the US, one each in Britain and France. And that combination of semi-factual information, glorification or vilification from the entertainment media, uh, and purveying a view of how people should think through the advertising media, that combination is pretty damn powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, I likened it in one of my videos to the scenes in the James Bond movies where they've got James Bond tied up and they're explaining their whole thing about how they're going to destroy the world and there's nothing you can do about it, Mr. Bond, because we've got you by the balls, etc. To like in a lot of cases, like because of their control of the media, there's films that come out in Hollywood that sort of detail what's going to happen before it happens. There was a
Mm-hmm.
lot of precursors to 9/11, especially in the films of Arnon Milchan, the Israeli arms
Mm-hmm.
trafficker. To what degree do you think that this kind of like revelation of the method stuff is disempowering, and do you think that there's any possibility that it can be used to our advantage, or do you think it's just
I think it's too
disempowering?
late. I really, And I'm not inclined to give up on things. I really am not. You
Yeah.
know, 10 years in the Marines gave a certain edge to some of the things I do and think. But you have to have a place to stand. You know, if you've got a fulcrum, you have to have a place to stand if you're going to move something. And there is no place to stand. There is literally no place to stand. There is such a blanket over the purveying of information in this country that anything Jewish leadership, to make that precise, uh, don't like can barely be spoken, even on the alternate media, you know, even on X to anyone else today. I can I really have never had any censorship on VK, which is the Russian social media platform. Um, but I've seen it on X.
X is really bad. X is terrible.
Yeah, seen it very clearly on X, on AOL.
People still use AOL.
Yeah,
Okay.
they do a little bit of it. And Facebook, of course,
Oh yeah, Facebook's the worst.
and Gab is pretty good.
I
Just
used to use Gab. I don't anymore.
it's pretty good. It's that's all, and it's very hard to do this uh, because particularly it these days we've gotten to a point where if anyone writes anything truly controversial, as the Zionists call it, they can be blanketed. They will be ruined. They will be ruined professionally. Uh, they can very often lose their jobs. They they can be bribed, maybe if they can be, uh, blackmailed if they can't, or killed if they really cannot be either bribed or blackmailed.
Yeah, and they've gotten more and more obvious about the
Sure.
killings over the years.
And they don't care anymore. When I first got into this, and that was just when social media was starting, uh, you could say almost anything on Facebook, for example.
Hmm.
And as I as I understand it, and I may be incorrect on this, the first actual deletion of videos and accounts happened on YouTube in 2018. And I think her name was Wojciech, the president and CEO of
Wojcicki.
YouTube.
Wojcicki. Yeah, she's dead now, actually.
Yeah, at 56 or 57, something
Yeah,
like that.
terrible cancer.
Yeah, terrible. Did we both smile?
Yeah,
Like that. But that was the first time it happened. And I found, and about by 2022, uh, all but five of the videos I had uploaded had been taken down. And my favorites for other things that I was looking at was the count has been deleted, the count has been deleted, the count has been deleted.
yep. Yeah, I've seen the
Okay.
same thing.
And that's the thing that really suppressed it. But if I was a real danger, or if or Helen or anyone else was a real danger, something very bad would happen to them, really. And it might just be just bad in terms of their career, of their financial situation, of their livelihood, uh, or it could be death. You know, I had two experiences of that. Uh, One was in Mississippi. I had left my car at the car dealer and picked it up, was getting ready to go down on an interstate, and I happened to stop in a Crystal drive-through and left the motor running and got my coffee, went off on the road. I was just turning up onto the interstate and I was going very slow, about 20 miles an hour because it was a sharp curve. Uh, and suddenly the right wheel bearing blew. I mean, a puffing cloud of black smoke. Uh, you would think it would do something else if your wheel bearing went, but that's it. Policeman right behind me slapped on his blue lights, and so no one could drive into me. Uh, but that was a couple of years after. the the Susan Modaris interview, and a couple of other articles I'd written, and some talks I gave. And if I had not slowed down to get that coffee and left the motor running, I would have been going 1 minute later. I would have been going 70 miles an
Oh
hour,
my God.
and that would have been like your
Yeah.
experience,
Yeah.
very much on that. And the second was up here in Pennsylvania. Uh, After that, I was just bending over the passenger seat in the front, and suddenly there was crashing of glass, and a car took off. I didn't hear the shot, so it probably had a silencer, but it went directly through the back window, directly through it, and nothing since, nothing since.
Hmm.
Just a lot of social things. So I can't call that one in terms of what it was doing or anything.
Well, not nothing since you said you've been barred from entering several countries.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, it's the whole campaign of the phrase "total demoralization." I think is Yuri Bezmenov's phrase, but
yeah,
I think that they come at you from multiple angles and just make you believe that the situation is hopeless, and
yeah,
that's
and they do it openly now.
yeah,
I mean, they would still have that same message back in the 1980s, in the Reagan administration. But he had an encounter with Menachem Begin, and someone in his office, several people were in his office when he was on the phone to Begin just after Israel had launched yet another of its attacks on Lebanon. And he said, "God damn it, Begin." No, he said, "God damn it, Menachem, this is a Holocaust. What you're doing to Lebanon, and stop." And Begin didn't stop, and so put a brigade of Marines in there and some carrier aircraft off the coast. And then, of course, the embassy bombing happened.
yeah. Oh, I know you think that there's not really a lot of future for this country. I recently saw a statistic this morning that 58% of college graduates from last year
Mhm.
still are unemployed, and that's a lot of fucking
58.
people. Yeah, 58%.
Wow.
Do you think there's any potential for revolution among the youth, or are they completely tuned out?
I don't see any possibility. Not of enough to make a difference. Not of enough to make a difference.
58% is a lot of people sitting around with nothing to do.
Yeah. Well, I think that what happened in 2020, when we had 6 months of rioting, arson, looting, mayhem, murder, uh, and that most heavily armed civilian population that I mentioned earlier sat on their hands and sat on their
Mm,
asses and didn't
yes.
do anything. And they were looking to Trump for leadership, and he didn't give it. But actually, he did, but he was giving the leadership in a different direction.
Yeah, you said Pied Piper of
I,
Mar-a-Lago.
I
Yeah,
thought Mar-a-Lago. I like that.
that's a good phrase.
I like you. I'll have to put that on a title, something if I can ever write again. But other than that, if they were going to do anything, they being the American people, regardless of their age, that would have been it. Sometime in those 6 months.
Or just COVID in general. People
Yeah,
would should have risen up against that. I remember they were
yep,
talking about going door to door, not only to administer vaccines, but to confiscate guns for a while. They wanted to
yeah,
do both at the same time. They thought better of that one. I guess they didn't think that that would go well. But yeah, the fact
yeah,
that people didn't stand up to the mass vaccination campaign was
yeah, that,
appalling.
yeah, and both of those, and, different issues, but the passivity on the part of the population was really striking. And it wasn't only in cities, it was in more rural states as well.
Yeah.
Just nothing would happen. And either the rioting was too far away, or it was too close and you didn't want to expose yourself to it, or it was raining or it wasn't raining. There was always excuses on this.
Yeah.
You can find excuses if you really don't want to do something. And when the icon of the conservative base, Donald Trump, does nothing, and you've committed yourself to him as his leadership, then you can always say, well, if it were really bad, he would do something.
Yeah.
And I heard several people say that in different ways in different states. If this were really bad, he would do something. Well, it was really bad, and he did something, and that was to keep you quiet.
Yeah, this conditioning
Yeah.
to abdicate personal responsibility and have someone else that you look to. I mean, is that cultural conditioning? Is that just a flaw in the American character? Is that like where does that come from? Because I feel like it wasn't always the case.
Well, it certainly wasn't the case through the 19th century.
Yeah.
Um, that was probably starting in the 20th, but I'm not quite sure when
Hmm.
I would put it down.
Because you can
It,
imagine like Americans who went out and settled the frontier and stuff,
yeah,
then coming back and sitting around and waiting to be told what to do by a guy in the White House.
yeah, not going to happen.
Yeah.
Not the way that happened. But everything changed in 1865. Uh, I personally think that slavery is wrong as a as a
An
moral,
enlightened view, yes,
yeah, it
yes.
is a moral issue. But the Confederate States constitutionally were absolutely correct uh, that they had a right to secede, and I have no doubt that if anyone has stood up at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia and said that sovereign states would voluntarily join together, uh, could not voluntarily leave that compact, there would not have been a constitution. It simply would not have been a constitution. And they were correct about it.
Okay, well, this probably try to finish up with this. To like, what future do you see going forward? How fast do you think the circling the drain is going to actually go down the drain in terms of the acceleration of the de decline of this country? And do you see any possible redemption on the other side?
I think General Flynn was correct when he said a couple of weeks ago, and again I just heard these, I can't read them, um, that we're one term away from the end of America.
Yep, sounds about right.
And what he didn't say is that it doesn't matter what term that is, which term, whether it's Trump this term or whoever comes in selection next on the line.
Mhm.
I think it's been really, really hard to see anything positive. I wrote about some things in that 4-part audio article. I guess that's what it is out of. And I talked about some things that we could do to perhaps buy time.
Yeah, you mentioned the counter migration thing. I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, uh, there's a concept in naval warfare called counter flooding. Normally you don't want to put water into a ship at sea, but there's one exception to that, and that if it's listing or going down to one side or the other uh, from battle damage, and you counter flood, you put water in on the other side of the area of the ship which has been hit, and then that levels it, and then you can continue it a bit and expose the damage to light, and so you can actually work on a
Fix it.
temporary repairs, something like that. And it isn't going to be possible to excise 40 to 44 million migrants, illegals, whatever we want to call them, concentrated in the cities without completely gutting the entire country.
And destroying the Bill of Rights more than it's already been destroyed.
Exactly, and the Israelis want to milk the cow. They don't want to sacrifice it yet, quite yet. And that's not going to be done. So this one of counter migration would be to pick and recruit family groups, whites from South Africa. It's about 4.5 million there, perhaps some from Argentina, none from Europe because they need everyone they can keep there. They don't need to have them leave. But look into East and Northeast Asia. Uh, Vietnamese have tight family groups, good work ethic. They beat us too in the
Why would they
military.
want to come here, though, is the question.
Right. Well, uh, why would they want to? Why would any of them want to on that? It would be a reverse side of what the Biden administration did with the illegals. And they moved mostly single males, 85 to 90% single males are what define the migrants here and in Europe. Uh, this would be taking family groups, same kind of incentive, but in that case, would be building on family groups, and there would be at least a chance. I don't have great hopes for it. I think that the South African whites would look at the United States as something close to a frying pan to fire. It
Possibly.
might very well be something like that. Some of the others, I don't really know. Could they come? Would some? Well, people did in the past. And if they're taking from the bottom of the barrel now to get individuals in this country, mostly single males, they're here for welfare and women, not necessarily in that order, but not work. Uh, we would take the other one, bring families over, large families, and that's entirely possible. But it would have to be couched very, very positively. There would have to be concrete benefits to them, and they could see the concrete benefits that they would be getting, and
Yeah.
not just hear about it, but see it, that this would matter. And I can't see anyone in the Trump administration doing that, picking up that ball and taking it. So I am not optimistic. Uh, I mentioned on one of Paul Adams' shows that back in 1970, when I first got to the University of Michigan and was getting ready to start my classes, I happened to pop into the public library and uh, found a new novel just been printed in 1970 by a man named Wallace Breen, Breen, and it's called Eagle in the Snow. And it's the semi-fictional tale of the last Roman legion to hold the Rhine frontier. And legion, it's about 5,000 men, auxiliaries about 5,000, you got 10,000 people. Right across the river, about 500,000 barbarians, multiple tribes out there. And he held them for a year and a half. Uh, and they found evidence of that in the novel. Let's just take it as the novel. It's a good novel, a good story. And he held them for about a year and a half, and then the Rhine froze. And he was standing there. He, the general commanding the legion, was standing there with his friend, who was his cavalry commander. Uh, and he looks across the freezing Rhine and at the bonfires all across the other bank. And he knows what's going to happen. We definitely know that. And he says to him, "This will cost them more than they realize. We shall not have failed altogether." And that's the best we can do.
Just try to take as many of them with us as
Yeah.
possible.
And damage them for others. I mentioned on a couple of shows, I'm not really sure if my sense of humor was appreciated. I said, if you're an optimist, buy Russian war bonds. If you're a pessimist, buy Chinese war bonds. If you're an American, you try and forget it.
Pretty much. How much longer do you think we'll even be able to talk about stuff like this before they'll just be able to silence information before it gets online?
That's a good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. They're almost there now.
Yeah.
They're almost there now. And and I think Trump is waiting until this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act which has been resubmitted to the Congress, to this Congress, if it gets through and he can sign it into law. I think it's going to take, he would prefer to wait to that point before doing the shutdown before speaking. Because I mean the executive orders have essentially the force of law, but it's easier to challenge an executive order than
Yeah,
it is piece of statutory legislation. And that's what it's going to be.
yeah, the only congressman who's going to vote against it is going to be Thomas Massey and Rand Paul, rather.
Yeah. Yep, that's it.
That's really distressing.
It is distressing. We have more years to work on it. Perhaps you'll win.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I share your view that bailing out of this country is probably the only chance of survival that we have. I don't see things getting better here. I just think that the people that are supposed to be on our side, the people that we're fighting for, just the masses in general, would rather rip our throats out for $7,000 per post
Yeah.
than actually stand up for their own
Yeah.
civilization.
Yeah. it very, very much on it. And, I think when I said that it really bothered me that not one person, not even one Marine general, stood up in the middle when that diatribe was going on
Yeah.
and walked out. Um, I should have seen that coming because when we did our uh, ungraceful exit from Afghanistan, proving that the Afghans, yes, my friends, have taken down yet another empire. They beat Alexander the Great and they chopped up a Mongol horde. Those two things should have been a hint.
Yeah, don't mess with these
Yeah,
guys.
these guys, whatever. Plus, you have nothing to get from it. Well, opium. You do have
That's
opium,
true.
but
That's a pretty
it's
major
it's
cash crop.
yeah, it's a big cash cow for the CIA and his fellow out there. But one person, I think he was a battalion commander, a Marine lieutenant colonel, he made some sort of a public presentation, and I don't recall what it was, but he called for accountability in who was responsible for a failure like this, that it actually made Vietnam's exit look good.
Yeah,
I mean,
true.
which having been there at the time, it was really, really, really hard to see anything good about it. But what we did with Afghanistan, uh, we left often without even telling the Afghan troops who've been fighting on our side over there, and
Oh, that's
they,
a disaster.
yeah, and they had their own settlement with the Taliban. This was not probably a kind one on it, but he lost his commission. His family left him. No one stood up for him. Not one general officer, not one corporal, not anything. No one stood up with him. No one was willing to do it. And that was a flat ass disaster right in your face. It was as much a slap for the military as 6 months of upheaval in 2020 was for the civilian population. And they did nothing. So you can take that back. 3 and 4 star generals have normally been in the services for 30 to 40 years. The majority of officers come through ROTC and they're exposed to the same propaganda as their civilian counterparts who do not go into ROTC and do not go into the services. Their enlisted personnel, all the junior enlisted personnel, have been given this steady diet of diversity, equity, inclusion through their entire academic career, from kindergarten up to high school and after that. And that the indoctrination, and I completely missed this. That was one of my two big mistakes. I completely missed the engine, the evidence, the tangible evidence uh, of my eyes, which was that the services had become so deeply infected that that degree of cowardice, of moral cowardice, was was rampant within them, with all of them. And yeah, I'm waving the Marine Corps flag here a little bit, um, but the Marines as a service have generally been held to be the best disciplined and the most committed of the services. There are good people in all of them. I'm not going to say there aren't, but as a service, uh, it used to be said that there was ex-soldiers, ex-sailors, ex-airmen, and Marines.
Hmm.
And I'm a pretty good example of that. I enlisted in 1959, which is a fair distance in the
I
past,
was gonna say it's a long time ago.
and the Marine Corps still has its stamp on me. It really has. And I'm not the only one. I mean, I'm not the only one by any means on it. But that should have told me what was happening. And that being that no one else stood up with this lieutenant colonel. The only person who lost anything was him. It was the
Yeah.
only person who did it. Uh, there were some other examples uh, that had nothing to do with the war. There was a woman lieutenant colonel who commanded, I can't remember if it was a squadron or group. I think it was a squadron. And she was relieved of her command and forced into retirement for creating a toxic environment in her squadron. Well, her toxic environment was that she expected everyone to do what the male Marines could do, everyone, and that didn't work. Hmm. And so she went up. But so one of my mistakes, one of my two major mistakes, was not acknowledging what the silence uh, what surrounding this lieutenant colonel was and what it meant, and it was a precursor to the absolute silence and acquiescence of all of the generals and admirals to this rubbing your face in your own shit bit,
Yeah.
which is exactly what it is. I can't. There's not a nicer way to put that.
No, it wasn't.
And I missed it. I really missed it. I didn't. I understood what it meant, but I didn't realize internally how deep it was. And that was a shock. That was my first mistake. My second mistake, actually. My first mistake, and it was one that affected 9/11. Uh, I looked at it and I said, we ought to concentrate on the World Trade Center, on the and what happened there, because there was that third tower that went
Oh
down.
yeah.
No plane hit it, it went down. The one that whatever went down in Shanksville was intended for WTC-7. It was the third tallest
Yeah.
building at the Trade Center. I think that's pretty obvious. Um, but I forgot one thing, and it was a major failing on my part. Even if anyone was able to persuade a substantial number of people that the World Trade Center was a hoax and that the Israelis had done it, or at least that the Arabs hadn't done it, might be an easier one to prove on that. Um, there was nothing they could have done about it. I mean, you couldn't collect a mass of people out there and focus them on something bad happening and doing anything about it. The Pentagon wasn't as visible in a national sense, but if that had been the focus right at the beginning, you know, a pilot, a pilot who couldn't fly a single engine propeller driven Cessna somehow managed to have it on a jetliner scraping over the ground, you know, and getting that V-shaped impact on the side of the Pentagon. If that had been the focus, those people could do something about it. They had the organization, they had the weaponry, they had the ability, and there are still some very good generals out there in all of the services. I mean, it wasn't as complete as it is 20 years later, 25 years later. They could have done it, and I made a serious mistake in not understanding that. In fact, I looked at the most visible one, which is the World Trade Center, uh, and the events surrounding it, yeah, and the third tower going down. But I forgot, but they can't do anything about it. The people in the Pentagon could, and I don't. And now I think it's too late.
Yeah.
Clearly, because of the response to that Marine Lieutenant Colonel calling for an accountability and the visible acquiescence on the part of what was it, 820, 830 generals and admirals,
Something like that. Yeah.
something like that, to that many generals and admirals, and no one
Sitting there and
thing.
taking it.
Yeah, they took it. Uh, they would have had tough trouble doing that even with a room full of sergeants in my day. We would have had to, and you want us to do what?
Yeah, and then that's the spiral of silence that I was talking about in my video last night. The just the fact that everyone has internalized the sense that they're the only one who feels insulted and who
Yes,
would want to stand up, whereas in the past there would be more of a group consciousness.
yeah,
They've really got us completely isolated, and we can't seem to break out of this. We're policing our own thoughts at this point.
yeah. That I think a lot of are doing, and I've noticed myself doing that. Well, noticed in the past tense when I could still, write posts and things like that. That while I might write what I want, there are topics I don't go to,
Yep.
and that's essentially policing myself.
Hmm.
Uh, but that's only on Facebook. Uh, I say some fairly nasty things on X, and I had one post with reduced visibility, and I was allowed to challenge it, and I did, and they reinstated it,
Well, that's good.
and that was about 3 years ago. But
That's the little like bit that they throw you, the little piece, the
yeah,
raw meat that they throw you to think, oh, X is a free speech platform.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
sure,
exactly
sure.
that, exactly that.
That's why the
It's
same five people look at my post every time. And I've got that several thousand followers, but no, the same five people.
yeah, I know it's pretty much what comes down on it. But yeah, that's about it.
All right. Now, is there anything else you want to add? Anything else you want to talk about?
Make them pay.
Make them pay. Well, that's a good way to end this. I think this has been a good interview with Dr. Alan Sabrosky, an American hero for standing up for this country in a way that very few people are willing to do. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.